But when you say influence, it is not about you, it is not about your work, actually, and it's not just about the skills that you have, it's about the people. And once you move to a different company or even a different project, the people involved are different.
Right.
And that's like when you move, you like what happens to your influence? Is it still there? Is it not there? Or like what is it actually?
So today's episode, we have Vijay Karthik joining us in the product street. And I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you.
I think we've known each other for quite some time now.
Yeah.
And I've been lucky enough to have been mentored by him. And he's like the expert, the go-to guy for me anytime I want to talk about anything in the product design space. And I think of all the things that we've spoken about so far, one of the conversations that I really enjoyed talking to you about is, the things beyond just the hard skills that a designer needs to possess. And that's going to be like what we're going to be talking about today.
Okay.
But before that, a lot of you might know him as the UX therapist. And but I will leave it to you to introduce yourself and tell them more about you.
Sure. First, thank you for having me join your podcast on this episode. Really excited about, talking to you and also reaching out to people who will be watching this. So for anyone that doesn't know me, just a quick hello. And I'm Vijay. I'm a designer. I've been in the product or UX design space for about 14 years now. And prior to that, a couple of years in visual arts and things like that. So yeah, right now I work at Google, and before that I was at Salesforce and at Pega Technologies. These are all like enterprise companies. And even now what I do at Google is very much on the business application front for Google Cloud. And we build software, or I help build software, I design. So yeah, for Google Cloud sales teams. So that's essentially what we do there, and I'm part of that team. And before that, also I was mostly working in the CRM and customer support space. So a lot of experience in the enterprise, but much before that, I was working with a design studio, and we did a lot of consumer and also cool tech products. And yeah, that's been my journey so far. And it's been great meeting you on ADP List, the whole community and platform. And yeah, really excited to talk to you and to the people watching this today.
Likewise, yes, I'm super excited about this episode as well.
Awesome.
So, product design in tech itself is such a highly cross-functionally collaborative role that a designer can't just sit in a silo and do all the work by himself. And we've got like any design that we're working on, a lot of people have stakes in it, and we've got them coming in at different stages of the process. You have like your engineers come in at some point, you have your product managers come in, and then you've got your research and content counterparts come in, or like your larger design team in itself, your manager, sometimes like the business execs as well.
Sure.
And because of this, I feel like it's more of a gray area than black or white, because we've got like, you could be literally the smartest, the most hardworking, the most skilled designer on the floor, and that still wouldn't guarantee that the people, your stakeholders are like sold on what you're proposing every single time you do it. And I think that's where the topic of, how you're being able to drive influence as a designer comes in. For starters. But then, before we dive any deeper, I want to ask you, just to set the context, what is your take on, what it means for a designer to be, to have influence?
Oh, wow. That is a pretty interesting topic, but there are like so many aspects to it. I think when you started talking about like how you looked at a designer being really skilled, maybe they are really the best at their craft, or like they're really good, but then still having to convince people of their ideas. That's how it came across. So I think interestingly, the idea is not one owned by the designer or like anything that is being proposed.
Yes.
And that's the most important way to look at it first. And that also helps you have others who are part of like what you're proposing. Yeah, we will talk about that. And then you asked about influence, and when you said influence, I was like immediately thinking, what is influence, right? Like when you're saying you designers having influence, what you're actually saying is how can I convince others, or like how can I have an impact on how others think or like perceive or like make decisions. Very interesting way I look at it is like these are not even soft skills. People
Yeah.
talk about it like, oh, they're like your craft, which is your hard skill, and then there are
Right.
like soft skills like how you communicate and collaborate. This goes beyond that. It's probably like there might be a lot of other skills that can contribute to your so-called influence. But maybe an example, like something I keep talking about is you might be really good at, let's say, Figma, or maybe prototyping, or maybe you're really good at organizing complex things with information architecture. All these are your craft skills. Let's say you move from one company that you're currently working at and you go to a different company. What happens to those skills?
Right.
They're still there, right? Like it's the same.
Yeah.
Even storytelling, you might be good at it. Maybe you worked on it for over a period of years, and now you're like really good at like explaining things to people. That doesn't change when you move to another company.
Right.
But when you say influence, it is not about you. It is not
Yeah.
about your work, actually, and it's not just about the skills that you have. It's about the people. And once you move to a different company or even a different project, the people involved are different.
Right.
And that's like when you move, you like what happens to your influence? Is it still there? Is it not there? Or like what is it actually?
Right. Suddenly it's a new set of people you're
Yeah.
exposed to, a new set of people you have to work
Yes.
with.
Yeah. So for me, the way to look at it is like it's not really a certain skill or something that you can go learn, or like,
Right.
you know, it's more a combination of these different skills, but it's about how you work with people. And yeah, it's
More like a people skill.
yeah, maybe
Oh, in a way.
yeah, in a way, yeah. So yeah, it's a very complex thing. So
True. But when was the first time that, in your career, you felt like you needed to be having more influence on what you were doing? When did you realize that there was a gap? Was there a specific point in time that you can recollect?
Oh, that's kind of, again, a tough one to say. It's a everyday challenge, right? Like,
Right.
imagine, like, maybe I'm just going back into like when I was like really starting with design. It was more about execution.
Right.
It's like, okay, we need to do this. Let me create something for it, and it's done, right? So there isn't much in terms of like who's making the decisions. I'm probably making decisions just for the UI, or like just for like how it looks, and I'm the expert in that room for that, or maybe like there's some peers who are like better than me at it, and it's just between us.
Yeah.
The number of people to sort of like agree on a decision is smaller.
Right.
But as you start growing in your career, or like you start working on products, you're working with like larger, teams. You have, as you started out talking about, like you have more stakeholders,
Right.
and the impact of your work is also changing, and your work is changing, and that's when actually, you start having these moments where you feel like, okay, I need to make sure that this decision being made is made right, or like I have to have a say in this decision. So
Right.
that's what, and those are like moments that you'll have every day as you keep
Yeah.
working. There are times when maybe you come across someone that says, we don't need any research on this. And you feel like, no, we need to do it.
Right.
Or maybe there's something that's easy to like convince, but there could be things that are more harder to convince. Maybe there's a decision that you're wanting to make on how you prioritize a feature. Now that's a more complex one. You have to involve your users, you have to get research, you have to get the insights to convince someone. So it's every day you'll have these moments. So it's not just one, and it's hard for me to say when was that one time that you felt
Right.
like you needed to have influence. Even today, after all these years, there are moments when you feel like, okay, I need to probably have a better way of like convincing someone, or like making sure that this doesn't get disrupted, or like we make sure that what we are trying to build gets built in the right way.
Okay, and now that you mentioned that, I
Mhm.
want to ask, how did you go about cultivating that approach?
Um, so again, going back to when I spoke about like how it's not really a skill, but like how you work with other people, and a big part of that is perception, right? Like how people perceive you, and that comes from the trust and credibility that you build. And I think that's really the foundation of influence. Like once people trust you and you're seen as someone that is credible, the ideas that you bring to the table and how you work with people, they tend to respect those ideas better once you build that trust. So for me, I would say it's been a long journey, and like throughout every place that I've worked for, interestingly, it has been that one very diligent with work, and like
Yeah,
it's not about like being just good at your craft, but also like how you approach work, how you make sure that you're consistent with it. One of the interesting things that happens with designers, particularly, is you're very excited about work initially, like a new project, a new thing that we're doing. You
right.
started working on something new, and you really put in like more than even 100%. I know no designer who are working only 9 to 5. It's like we are constantly problem solving. We are constantly like creating what we have to, but that sets a baseline expectation of like how you'll work.
Yeah,
So you have to be mindful even of those things when I say being diligent and like being good at your work. So that's a no-brainer. That's like the number one thing, and that helps everyone look at you with trust. Like you can be trusted to get things done,
right.
and you are predictable in like how you can approach work. So those are like really the baseline things. And what do you need for that? Always learning. There's so many things to learn, even every day in design. There's so many things changing. Depending on the product that you're working, you have to learn even about maybe a new industry, healthcare, or like
Yeah,
CRM or banking, whatever you got yourself into. So you have to be really good at that as well, and not just design. But
right.
then, since you are the design expert, you have to be really good at just not creating the design, but being able to explain the why of those decisions. And yeah, that all adds up to the foundation that I said, which is trust and credibility.
Got it.
Beyond that, I would say being able to communicate clearly. And when it comes to communication, I think there's again a way to look at it is more context with less content.
Mm,
So I don't know how to better phrase it, but you can even think of it as like visualizing information is more important.
right.
Like communication is not just about like
Having good
between,
English or
yeah,
great vocabulary.
yeah, absolutely not. And it's also not just about communicating with one person as such. Like it's also about how you can communicate with a larger team, with a
Right.
larger audience, with when you're not even there, how do you communicate? By writing a good
Right.
document or a UX brief, or like putting together a presentation. So all of this comes under communication.
So I was also able to think of it this way,
Yeah.
that when you're talking about communicating things, like you said, there are, I think a key part of being a good communicator is being able to adjust the intensity of details depending
Yeah.
on the audience you're presenting it
Yes.
to.
Yeah.
Because when you're presenting your designs to maybe say the developer, you're probably doing like a feasibility check.
Yeah.
The way you're explaining things might be different from how you would present the same design to probably like the leadership, for example.
Yes.
And I think that could also involve, change in jargons or the way you're presenting stuff, but depending on who you're speaking to.
That actually trickles down to another aspect, which is being able to speak the same language.
Right.
This is something that you will, like anyone who has worked in design and had to interact with engineering,
Yeah.
they might have felt that, like, okay, how do I explain design to them? But at the same time, how do I understand their world?
Right.
And when it comes to building digital products, you need to have that understanding as well, being able to understand how tech works, whether it is not just how you create things, how do they go live, what happens between,
Right.
and like all that. That is also super important. So being able to communicate that with engineers, and think of the same with your product and your business stakeholders and your partners.
Yeah.
So there you have to be able to understand why we are doing this, like what is the ROI on this, what are the metrics that we will be looking at to say that we succeeded at it.
Right.
and you should be able to speak their language as well. So it's like broadening your understanding of product beyond just design and user-centric design,
Right.
looking at even what it means to the business, what it means to actually build that. So those also become part of your, like, we can think of it as like the number three. Like once we spoke about trust and credibility, then we spoke about communication. So this becomes like uh, being able to work with others.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. It's the jargon part also applies to the users when you
Yeah.
bring them into the picture.
yeah, absolutely. And their researchers are your best partners.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
if you have dedicated UX researchers. So yeah, as we were talking about this, right, it looks like, okay, you got your foundations right, you're good with your skills and all of that. But where does influence, when do you start feeling like you need to have an influence? I think most of our work is about making decisions, and design, I think, is like informed decision making.
Right.
But everybody else is also making decisions based on the information that they have. So it's something I look at it as like you're not competing in making these decisions. Like you're collaborating, and you're doing it for either meeting the user needs or making sure that your product is successful, and that should be the guiding thing. And you're not really like competing with an engineer, or like you're not. But that's where like you need to develop the skill set of what I call as like involving others. Like how do you bring stakeholders together?
Yeah.
So that itself is another skill set. So the way you can do, as I said, like we were just talking about it, being able to speak their language, but also being transparent. What I mean by that is, okay, here's a decision that we have to make. This is what are the inputs that we have from our UX research partners, and this is what product is thinking. So you come together, and one of the great ways to do that is co-creation. It's not like you listen to like a PRD or a requirement, you go back and you come with the solution.
Yeah.
That is never going to happen, and that's not how you should be working if someone is working that way. So it's always about encouraging the sort of like co-creation where you're involving maybe the eng lead, or maybe even all the engineers where needed. And a great way to do that is FigJam.
Oh yeah.
You can always start brainstorming with
Together,
people
everybody's on the same board.
Yeah, and you can also do it like you keep that artifact, and then you can
Work around it.
Yeah, work around it with different people at different times.
Yeah.
And the other thing is to build these partnership with research is like your best partner.
It's a given.
Yeah, I mean, design is so subjective. So what helps you make decisions on design is either the heuristics or the principles. They apply to largely how something looks, but what you should be building, that should be informed by how what you're building is working for the user, and that's where you have your research partners.
Yes.
They can help you understand the pain points, or like if things are working or not working. And if someone is in a job where they're the only designer, or maybe they don't have a different research team, that should be their priority.
Yeah.
More than anything, they should focus on like learning from the users, and that becomes what you will bring to the table as to make a decision.
Right.
Like, hey, this is what we have understood, and which is why we have to make this decision. But then sometimes it's not always about a UX choice, but it could be things like prioritizing the scope of a feature and things like that. And that's where you need your product partners.
Right.
And which is why you have to build these partnerships, and you have to work very closely. And I think co-creation is a great way to involve everybody. Everybody feels like this is a decision that we have made collectively.
Right.
It's not like design team recommending this, or like this is what we want to do. And yeah, so that's one other aspect.
I love how you said you're not competing, but you're actually collaborating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I was in a similar situation that I can relate to, where I was a couple years into UX, and I had an idea that I was good with communication, that I was able to get my ideas across to people when I wanted to. That was until this one time when I was working with a client of ours. They're like a well-renowned big brand in the chemical manufacturing industry. And so I was I was put responsible to work on or to redesign a little tool that they had that their chemical analysts were using, and it was originally designed by the same guy I was sort of reporting to back then.
Okay.
Now the thing is that this guy over here, he's like an industry veteran. He's been doing this for a long, long time, and he really knows his stuff. Versus me, I was in consulting back then, so I'll have to learn the industry a little bit, the domain that I'm working with a little bit. I was still at that stage where I'm still getting used to it. And then there's him. Now, this is how working together would go. We know what we're going to solve, the problem that we're tackling, and then we're like approaching it, say, flow by flow. And then he would help me put together a wireframe when we think we're ready to go into the UI bits. And that's when, he would come in and then he would insist a certain element be positioned a certain way, for example.
Okay.
And then I would immediately go in and say, oh, but then that's going to, violate this law, and then this principle, blah, 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 UX principle, blah, blah, blah. And slowly it came to this point where all the arguments, they made the meetings feel so unpleasant for both of us. And at one point, I knew I had to do something about it. So the next time I went in, I thought maybe I'll just listen. Because throughout the time, I consistently had a feeling that he wasn't open to listening what I had to say.
Oh.
So I thought maybe what if, I tried doing that on the call when he's suggesting or rather insisting that we do certain things a certain way. I'll just listen. I'll let him talk. I'll make him feel heard, and then we'll see. So the next time we did it, I started off with that. And then exactly when I knew things were, following the same pattern like we've observed all these times, I said, okay, it seems like a fair point. Let me take it back. Let me think upon it, and I'll get back to you. And the next time I saw him is when I said that, hey, although this seemed fine, but turns out doing it this way could have an impact on this other thing right here. Now, this time, to my surprise, slowly, his response to how, my inputs were taken also changed. Because now he was willing to listen.
Okay.
It's almost like this, right? We as UXers, we talk so much about empathizing with users. We're like so good at seeing things from their point of view. And yet, I think we fail to do the same with our own stakeholders, who are the people who are like holding the keys to the success of our product.
That's a great way to put it. I mean, you have to be empathetic, not just to the user, but also to everyone that you're working with.
Yeah. And what I learned the hard way here is to never make your stakeholders feel like an outsider.
That's a great insight.
Because that was precisely what I was doing there. Now it was more like a competition rather than a collaboration, like you just said. So as soon as you brought that point, I was reminded of this episode back then. But yes, great point. You're not competing, but you're in a stage where you're collaborating together for like the greater good of your product and your users and the business. I like how you put that.
And that reminds me of something, which is being self-critical, or at least being able to like reflect on like how you're perceived and like how you're working with others, right? And there's it's a very interesting blog. I think Neil on software, he created this sort of like proto personas or like artifacts. Like he gave certain labels for like the disenfranchised designer, or
is this where he talks about the hard nuts to crack in like every department?
Yes, working with how to work with hard people or something like that.
Right.
I think that is a great way to understand how others are perceiving you. And it's very interesting to look at. It's not like stereotyping, but we all have behaviors that can be predictive. And might fit into some of the ways in which he describes, how you'll have engineers of certain kinds and like product managers of certain types and even designers. But just looking at them makes you wonder, like, were there moments where I came across as this to someone? It's not like a personality thing where you like become one of those. He has animal caricatures, or that's how I remember, maybe a bat or like a badger or whatever. But it's not like you are that type of a designer. It's just that there are moments in which when you come across as one of these, and you should be mindful of those. Are you someone who is like being a blocker just by insisting that this is how it has to be done? Or are you someone who has become so uninterested in the product that you have stopped really challenging anything and you're like, okay, let's do anything that you want to do?
Right.
None of those are good. So you have to be mindful of like what you're becoming.
Yeah.
And yeah, we should definitely share that so people can look at it. So
Totally.
yeah, that's another
Yes.
great thing. And to continue that aspect of like reflecting or understanding, I think a great thing that we all should be doing is asking for feedback, making sure we understand how others are like thinking of us or like perceiving us.
Yeah.
So always set up one-on-ones or like meetings, even if there's nothing particularly related to work that you have to discuss, but reach out to your stakeholders, regularly.
Yeah.
Ask for feedback, ask for things that you can improve, not just the good things that you're doing. So yeah, those also add up to like how you can develop these different habits that help you, have that influence in how decisions are made.
Yeah, now that we spoke about the aspect of co-creation, like you said, what are some strategies that you put to play at work today to tackle this exact thing we're talking about?
Yeah, I think co-creation itself is one of those strategies. Like you can think of it as like involving everybody in the decision making.
Right.
Even if it is design decisions that are being made, you are driving it, but then you want others to participate in it. So that's one great way, an approach to ensure that the right decisions are made, or rather decisions are made for the right outcomes.
Right.
So yeah, that's one approach. The other is to look at it as like it's not just you who's at stake, right? It's not me. It's not my decision that is being not approved, or like something that I'm proposing that is not getting acceptance. It's also collectively a decision has to be made, or
Right.
like you have to move in a certain direction because of these things. And
God, there's a lot of factors that
yes.
come into play.
And a lot of people.
Right.
And that's where I think that building those partnerships, and again, a fun story is this non-detailed book that we had in high school, which is
Right.
the Trojan War.
CBSE?
No, state syllabus. State
Okay.
syllabus had that.
Okay.
In the Trojan War, everyone loves Achilles. He's like immortal.
Right.
He's almost like a godlike warrior, right? But who won the war? It's actually, if you ask me, it is Ulysses. He was a strategic person. In fact, he was the one who convinced Achilles to, join the war.
Right.
But it's like being able to build those relationships or partnerships and allies. I think that is the most important thing. There will be times when a certain decision is even beyond your, I wouldn't say hierarchy, but yeah, there are things that need a top-down,
Right.
direction. Then what do?
Yeah.
You ideally reach out to your manager and then to others who can like come together and help make that work. So it's also about like having those relationships and those partnerships and seeking help when needed.
Right.
And yeah, that's the other thing. I think that's one more strategic way to ensure that you will have a say in what is being built or like what is being shipped to the users.
Yeah. I like how you said that, bringing in people into the process
Yeah.
very early on.
Yes.
Or because, how designers often complain about, when you're done designing, and then depending on the, UX maturity of the environment you're working
Yeah.
in, let's say, the designer built something or like designed something, and then he's taking it to the engineers, and then it's be like, we want this built. Is this okay? And then the response is going to be like, okay, this might be too much of a tech effort, but maybe we could do something else. And then designers not being okay with that. But ideally, it would have been so much better if, you set the context out for the developers by including them early on in the design.
Yes.
And luckily, part of being a UXer is, doing stuff like, you're doing user flows, you're bringing in the personas into the picture, and then you're looking at the journey together. This, when it's cross-functional, is even more efficient because you're bringing the entire team on the same page as you. Now, developers might probably have lesser inhibition when they're approaching the same problem as you because they're more informed right now.
Absolutely. And a big part of this, like what is the outcome of co-creation, is an early identification of the challenges that the stakeholders might have. Like you may not be so perceptive to the challenges that the engineering team will have.
Right.
So once they're involved early and then you have built this working relationship, you are able to speak their language, they'll be more trusting and transparent. They'll tell you their challenges.
True.
It's not just going to be like why we shouldn't be doing it. It will also be like what are the challenges in doing it.
Right.
So yeah, that's a great way to bring alignment. And then of course, you have to constantly look at what is it that we have to achieve. And that should be the guiding factor for like what gets made at the end of the day.
At the end, it's not either, whose word's going to float. It's about what's our North Star? How are we moving towards it as a team?
Yeah.
I love that.
That's it. Yeah. It's either the user, the business, or those are the things that you should use as the guiding North Star.
Got it. So now that you've given us a really good helicopter view of how you can drive influence as a designer, could you tell us something about what are some everyday things at work that you can check those boxes and then move closer towards being better at driving influence?
Oh wow,
I can put it that way.
Yeah, I think just looking at how we work every day as a designer, one, when you start working on a new project or anything, ensure you map out all the stakeholders. So there are different metrics. People use this in like it, just like product managers write a PRD, UXers write a UX brief, and you start identifying who are all the stakeholders that are involved. So there are different models for this approach. There's the RACI and all of that. Depending on whatever your company follows, you can do that, like your larger design team. But essentially what you should be doing, and even if this is not a practice, you can bring it to your team and to your company, which is who's driving the decision. It's usually you as a UXer. If it is a UX thing, if it is a product thing, it's the PMs who are driving that. But who's approving it? Like all these decisions that have to be made. On the UX front, there could be crits and reviews, and you might need approvals. Who are those people? On the product side, maybe there are similar things, and on the inside, there'll be similar things. So you need to know all these people, and you start looking at who's driving it, who's approving it, who are your collaborators, usually your PM, UX, and Eng leads, and all of that, and who should be kept informed. Sometimes, depending again on like how large an org you're working in, something that you're building, that you're creating, might have an impact on your this adjacent team or this other product that uses your product. And so you should be aware of everyone that gets impacted. So whoever is getting impacted should be kept in the loop. That's the informed. So you start thinking of all these people, then you apply the same things of like, who should I involve in the co-creation? Of course, your PM and your research is like, you work with them every day. But then who else should you include when you start exploring these ideas? Who should you, and at what time should you ensure that you get the right, approvals or like reviews? Should make sure of that by having regular crits or like sharing work, even if there's no formal, critique sessions that are happening. You should share your work more broadly and early. So those are the things really I can think of. And then talking about sharing work, one other thing, maybe this relates to like building relationships. It's not just always about the everyday work that you're doing, right? You should find opportunities to connect with people intellectually. What I mean by that is that we spoke about how trust and credibility is the foundation. How does it build over a period of time? It comes from you being an expert, and whether it is UX, the principles of it, or the trends that are happening, and also the industry that you're working in. Recently, there was someone who asked me about dark patterns for UX, and particularly in e-commerce.
Oh, that's a fun topic.
Yeah, it has been years that I've worked in anything remotely e-commerce. And I was like, I don't even like recollect all of them. But those are the things, right? Like you can have a fun share out with your team. If you're working in e-commerce, maybe that's a great thing to share. So it's always about building, the trust and credibility that you have, and it doesn't have to always be so specific to your work. Maybe it is
Right.
even about things like how design sometimes is deceitful, and or like dark patterns, or maybe just trends in your industry.
Yeah.
What's happening in the CRM space, which I work in. So this also reminds me, like when I was at Pega, which was a CRM company, I used to regularly follow the PR. Like there was an app, I think it's Owler or Owl,
Okay.
something, which you can track a bunch of companies.
Oh,
Like you can
okay.
go in and then say, okay, this is my competitor, or these are the companies or industries that I'm interested in. And it is all public news. It is
Right.
a PR, newswire stuff that is all collected.
Okay.
And you can look at what is happening in your industry, what's happening in healthcare, what are the new things that are emerging, what's happening in customer support, or like what's happening with AI. You become like this source of ideas and inspiration for everybody.
Right.
So you can do that. Like you can constantly, when you're having interactions or even like some sessions where you're sharing these observations, that
Right.
also help build trust and credibility. So
Got it. Owlo, is it like still live?
I think it's owler.com if
Okay.
I'm recollecting it. But yeah, there are other tools as well. And
Okay.
yeah, even Google search, you can set up alerts, right?
Right.
For certain.
Yes.
Yeah.
Analytics is another great tool. You go
Yeah,
in and then
yeah.
based on a keyword, you're
Yes.
like searching stuff. That's what I was able to draw parallels for when you were talking about
Yeah.
Owlo.
So this was more like, it's almost like all the news that is being published, you have it in one place.
Okay.
So if you're following like 3 or 4 companies, you can say, okay, what's happening with this industry overall?
Right.
You can also look at, particularly in enterprise space, there's Gartner. They publish a lot of reports. They look, and then you have the big consulting companies that
Right.
publish these, good analysis of like future-looking things.
Yes.
You can look at all this as like growing a better understanding of the space that you're working in, and then you start sharing about this.
Yeah.
So that builds again your credibility and like reputation, and that in a way helps when you're in a room and you're trying to make a decision. So yeah,
That's true. Like there are some wonderful resources, if I'm not wrong. Harvard Business Review, HBR publishes some great stuff
Yes.
along the same lines that you
Yeah.
mentioned. McKinsey has reports, a
Yeah.
specific app that they use to
Yeah.
communicate this sort of thing. I think if you're looking for something, it's out there.
yes. And maybe the last thing I want to touch upon is that we spoke about influence at workplace,
Yeah.
but if you step out of the workplace, this is a thing in everyday life as well. I mean, at family, in relationships, or anywhere. Like today, nobody lives in a joint family, but back in the days when there were like a lot of people living together in a house, it was a similar thing. Like, how does someone make a decision?
Right.
There's no authoritative way of making decisions. So, like even in the most traditional families, it's still a collective decision that is made.
Yeah.
So the same things are happening here. So even in workplace, we should be sensitive to that people aspect. And I think if someone is a manager or like, they should focus on also getting their teams or like their cross teams, like anyone that you're collaborating with together for these people activities. It's like, I know of companies that like I went through the interview process where the Myers-Briggs personality test was also part of the interview.
Oh.
This is long back.
Okay.
Like now I think most companies have stopped doing anything like that.
Right.
But maybe not when interviewing, but once
Yes.
you're in a company, once you have a team, you should also have these ways of understanding each other as a human. And as
I think Standout is a great tool
Oh,
today,
yeah.
which does sort of the same thing.
Yes.
I think when a team takes it, it assigns roles based
Yeah.
on how they assess your personality to be your work personality, your work
Yeah.
front especially. So I think it gives you titles like, are you a teacher? Are you a creator? Are you a provider?
Yeah.
And stuff like that. And then I've personally seen Standout have like the people activities that teams can take together.
Yep.
And I've personally used them at work, which is
Nice.
why it's come from like the top of my head.
Yeah.
But
I think being sensitive to that as well, like everyone comes from different,
yeah.
upbringing, and then
True.
there's a lot of differences that we have. But how do we come together? By understanding those and being sensitive to those aspects. So I think doing this sort of analysis, or like you were saying, standout or
Yeah.
any other tool, that was also helps everyone, not just you,
True.
to better understand, and then you can work better together. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I agree with how you said, stuff that we're talking about
Mhm.
do not just impact our life at work, but
Yeah.
it's definitely pulling in all sorts of relationships you have.
Yep.
Because this reminds me of this book that I read, which was written by, he's this international hostage negotiator.
Wow.
He worked for the FBI, and then he put together this book. I think it's called Never Split the Difference. It was
Mhm.
written by Chris Voss. That's his name. And he talks about how every little interaction that you have with people, be it at work, be it
Yeah.
at family, any relationships that you have, it's all negotiations in a way, because we're talking about driving influence, and being a good negotiator is, I think it's closely tied to that as well.
Yes.
Yeah, and things he talks about are part of your everyday life.
Yeah.
And there are like everyday situations that you go through with other people in your team and people at home, situations
Yeah.
very relevant to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a great read if we want to dive more into
Yeah.
this topic.
Great. Yeah. We should definitely link that as well then.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We should.
Awesome.
Yeah. So Vijay, have you got any unpopular opinions when it comes to how people drive influence at work as product designers?
Oh, unpopular. I mean, I would say today our entire conversation we kept referring to like why we would make a certain decision, and we kept saying to do the right thing for the user or for the business.
Right.
But I think if you're truly honest, it's also at times that it's also for self. Certain decisions you're making, or like you're pushing for because for yourself or for your team.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think we have to be mindful of that.
Okay.
To have a balance between like doing the right thing for the user or for the business, and also for your team or yourself. So that's
Okay. But I'm actually curious when you say look at it from a standpoint of how is it beneficial for the users, or how is it good for me? Can you
Okay.
drill down on what you mean by how is it good for me?
Oh yeah, I mean it's not like it's not a choice between meeting the user need and like
Your need.
your need. But being truly honest, it's like you go to work every day. They're great companies. They're like great philosophies. Everyone talks about maybe having impact on the lives of people that are using the product that you're creating, particularly in tech. But honestly, there's also other reasons why you're going to work every day, right? Maybe you want to get that paycheck.
Yeah.
That's
Let's be
there.
real. Yeah.
Let's be real. So, and also there are aspects of that for everybody else in the room that you're sitting together and working with.
Right.
And there's also the aspect of a personal growth, or like you want to grow as a designer, somebody else wants to grow as an engineer, and everyone, and that's also at stake when you're making decisions at work. So being sensitive to that, I think that's what I meant
Got it.
by watching out for like what's the right thing to do for the team. Sometimes maybe you're making a decision, prioritization or whatever, and it can have impact on someone. So also be mindful of that. So it's the same thing that I keep talking about. When you're building a product, it's the user, it's the business, and also everybody else.
Yes.
You have to be mindful of everyone. So yeah, that's what I meant by that.
Got it. So that's a lot of things to unpack right there.
Okay.
Right. And I loved having this conversation with you. I think these are the nitty-gritties that people don't really talk about enough or talk about in the open. But I'm glad, you are such an advocate for this, because driving influence as a designer is quite imperative for anybody to be in the field or like sustain in the field.
Yeah, I mean, it's as in the beginning we spoke about it. It's an everyday thing,
right?
And it's something that you keep working on. So be mindful of it. And there are books that talk about how to have power, or like how to be better at negotiation and all this. Yeah, those are great. but also being sensitive to the aspect that it's at the end of the day, it's other humans and you're all working together. So as long as you're mindful of that and being sensitive, I think it's
And
great.
being self-aware of,
Yeah,
when
self-aware.
you are
Yes.
becoming,
Yes.
the person that you
Yes.
despise, or, being
Yeah,
the
yeah.
hard nut to crack that we spoke about.
Yep.
Because like you said, it might not be your entire personality.
Yes.
There might be moments where you are
Exactly.
being that,
Yeah.
one of those
Animals.
yes,
Yeah.
one of those
Okay.
animals.
Okay.
That's right. But I think, when you put these things into play,
Yeah.
every day you're becoming like better at tackling this exact dynamics at work.
Yeah.
And you're just at a better place. You're at a position of being less defensive and protective of your work.
Yeah.
And you're looking at it from a collaborative aspect, like the larger good.
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful. Thank you for being here in this episode today. I love chatting with you on this.
Always, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast and this
Of course.
episode. And yeah, thank you.